The billionaire's funeral was supposed to close a chapter, but one sealed envelope and one overworked nurse uncovered a secret that not only changed a billionaire's fate, but her own. Before we begin, take a breath and think, what would you do if the truth could ruin a man's name or save his soul? Now, stay with me, because by the end of this story, you'll have to decide whether you'd have done what Andrea did. But before we continue, hit subscribe, like this video, and tell me in the comments where in the world you're watching from and which part of the story hit you the hardest. Now let's get back to the story. The winter wind howled through Greenwood Cemetery in Brooklyn, carrying whispers through rows of marble graves. Reporters lined the gates like vultures in designer coats, flashes cutting through the gray afternoon as they captured every tear, every whispered scandal. At the center of it all stood Maris George, widow of Manhattan's legendary automobile tycoon Davis George, a woman so polished she could turn grief into performance. Her pearl necklace trembled slightly, the only sign her poise might be cracking. Beside her, Alex and Gloria George, the late billionaire's siblings, watched the press hungrily, the way wolves watch an open field. And a few feet away, Davis Smith, the grieving son, stood apart, his hands buried deep in his coat pockets, his face pale under the gray sky. In his right hand, a sealed envelope. No return address. Just 5 words printed in red ink. DNA report, do not ignore. Across town, under buzzing fluorescent lights, Andrea Smith, a 5-year-old intern nurse at St. Mary's Hospital, woke to the taste of cold coffee and exhaustion. Her scrub top was wrinkled, her stethoscope tangled around her neck like an afterthought. She blinked at the computer screen beside her and froze. Her hospital login had been used while she slept. The file opened. Davis George genetic profile. Andrea's pulse quickened. She hadn't touched that patient's file since the night he died. And yet, there it was, accessed, modified, and logged under her name. She leaned back, staring at the screen like it might blink back. Somewhere in her chest, a quiet dread whispered that this was no simple mistake. Back at the cemetery, the priest's voice droned through the cold air. Davis Smith barely heard it. He was too busy staring at the envelope, its edges creased from his grip. Should he open it now? At his father's burial? When he finally tore the seal, a white sheet slipped free. His stomach twisted as he read the bold black line at the top. Paternity test inconclusive, biological relationship not detected. Across the city, Andrea scrolled through hospital logs, line by line. The timestamps didn't make sense. Neither did the file's new note, tagged in red, for review by George, a state copy sent. Someone had used her credentials to send a copy of Davis George's DNA data outside the hospital. And for reasons she couldn't yet explain, Andrea felt the name George might soon decide the course of her life. In less than 24 hours, the billionaire's son would be accused of being an imposter. And the tired nurse who discovered a line of code in a patient file, she'd be blamed for leaking it. Neither of them knew it yet. But one envelope and one login had just connected their fates and started a war that could tear New York's elite apart. By sunrise, the envelope had already done its damage. Inside the marble halls of the George family's Upper East Side estate, the tension felt heavier than the morning fog outside. Davis Smith stood in the study where his father had once negotiated billion-dollar car deals, staring at the printed DNA report spread across the desk. The words blurred every time he looked at them. Paternity test, inconclusive biological relationship not detected. It didn't make sense. He looked like his father, talked like him, even had the same stubborn tilt to his jaw that Maris used to tease them about. But the black and white letters on the page stripped away 30 years of certainty. In the hallway, muffled voices rose. His Aunt Gloria was already on the phone with a journalist. His uncle Alex, ever the opportunist, was in the kitchen speaking to the company's attorney. When Davis stepped into the room, both went quiet. Alex turned with a practiced look of sympathy that never touched his eyes. "Davis, the board needs to protect the company. Until things are clarified, I'll act as interim CEO. Temporary, of course." Davis clenched his jaw. "You couldn't wait a day after the funeral?" Alex gave a faint smile. "The markets don't grieve, nephew." He walked out, leaving Davis alone with Gloria, who avoided his stare and whispered, "The sooner you accept it, the better. DNA doesn't lie." By noon, everyone in Manhattan seemed to know. Tabloids blared the headline in bold, merciless type. "Fake heir at George Motors? Billionaire's son exposed." TV anchors dissected the story over coffee. Stock tickers bled red as George Motors shares plunged. Across town, in the fluorescent hum of St. Mary's Hospital, Andrea Smith's name was being whispered in a different way. She sat stiffly in a tiny HR office as her supervisor, Nurse Director Evelyn Carver, closed the blinds. Evelyn slid a printed email across the table. "Your login was used to access and send confidential DNA records. The George family's attorney has filed a formal complaint." Andrea's throat tightened. "I didn't send anything. Someone used my credentials while I was asleep." Evelyn sighed, her tone almost kind. "Andrea, you're an intern? You don't get involved in Billionaire's medical files unless someone tells you to. And no one told you to." Andrea shook her head, the sting of injustice sharper than fear. "I didn't do this." Evelyn leaned closer, her voice low. "Listen to me, honey. You crossed someone powerful. Let it go. Go home, take a few days off, and pray this blows over. That's the smartest thing you can do." But Andrea wasn't good at pretending. That night, after the rest of the nurses left, she sat in front of the dim hospital monitor again. The glow reflected in her tired eyes as she typed in her credentials. The system warned her, "Access restricted, activity logged." She entered anyway. There it was, Davis George's file, still tagged under her name. But the access history had changed. New entries had appeared within the last hour. Her name, her login. Timestamp, 10:42 p.m. Andrea glanced at the wall clock. It was 10:42 exactly. Her pulse spiked. Someone was editing the file in real time. Lines of data flickered across the screen. The genetic sequence, she remembered, gone, replaced by a completely new dataset with a different chain ID. At the bottom of the file, a note flashed briefly before disappearing. Authorization, GEM, internal transfer complete. Andrea slammed the keyboard, but the screen froze, then logged her out. She sat back, heart pounding, the hum of the lights suddenly deafening. Meanwhile, uptown, the George Motors boardroom looked more like a war room. Alex George stood at the head of the table, projecting confidence as he addressed investors over video call. "The company remains stable. Davis Smith's personal situation has no bearing on operations," he said smoothly, while his hand discreetly signed a document transferring millions in company funds into a trust review account. A reporter outside the building shouted, "Mr. George, is it true your nephew isn't the rightful heir?" Alex smiled for the cameras. "The company has always been a family business," he replied, "and family is complicated." Back inside, Davis sat in the corner, silent, watching his uncles spin their lives into a press strategy. Every word made his stomach twist. He didn't know if the DNA was true, but something about Alex's calm certainty felt rehearsed, like a man playing a part he'd practiced long before the funeral. At St. Mary's, Andrea printed the last visible system log before it vanished. When she glanced down, her own signature line appeared again at the bottom of the report, digitally forged. She whispered, "They're setting me up." She backed away from the monitor, fighting the trembling in her hands. In one night, she had gone from anonymous nurse to scapegoat in a corporate scandal. But as the city outside pulsed with sirens and headlines, Andrea's exhaustion began to harden into something else, not fear, resolve. She didn't know how deep this went or why her name was being used. But she knew one thing for sure. Someone powerful wanted the world to believe a lie. And if she didn't find out who, it wouldn't just destroy her. It would destroy an innocent man, too. That night, the lights of Manhattan glittered cold and distant through the hospital windows. Somewhere in an Upper East Side penthouse, Davis Smith poured a glass of whiskey he didn't drink and stared at his father's portrait. Two strangers, miles apart, each trapped in their own nightmare, both about to realize the same truth. When power writes the story, honesty becomes the enemy. The night shift at Street Mary's had its own kind of silence, sterile, endless, filled with the faint hum of machines and the whisper of fluorescent lights. It was the kind of quiet that made people confess things or lose their minds trying not to. Andrea sat in front of the hospital computer again, her reflection flickering in the monitor. The system logs she'd saved earlier were gone, overwritten by an automatic purge. Someone high up had triggered a digital cleanup. Still, she had one advantage the cleanup couldn't erase. She remembered what she saw. She logged in under a temporary profile she'd created, praying it would go unnoticed. Navigating into the restricted archive, she clicked through the encrypted folder for Davis George Patient ID 14827. A pop-up warned, "File flagged for legal confidentiality." Andrea clicked override. The screen flickered, and for half a second, the page broke into scattered fragments of code. Among the lines of data, a string of text glowed faintly, tucked inside a metadata tag that shouldn't have existed. Check sample B. Not a mistake. Protect him. D. G. Andrea froze. The initials hit her like a physical blow. D. G. Davis, George himself. Her heart raced. The billionaire had left a message inside his own file. A warning, maybe even a confession. She whispered to herself, "Protect who, Mr. George?" By now, she knew she couldn't rely on the hospital's main system. Someone was controlling it remotely. She needed proof, something physical. The original blood sample mentioned in the file. That meant one place, the cold storage lab in the basement. Few interns ever went down there. The air smelled of disinfectant and frost. Rows of freezers lined the walls, each marked with color-coded tags. Andrea's breath clouded as she stepped inside, flashlight trembling slightly in her hand. She found the storage logbook and scanned for Davis George's patient ID. Drawer 12B. She crouched, pulled open the compartment, and stared at the empty slot. The vial was gone. Every other slot was neatly labeled, perfectly organized. Only his was missing. A chill ran down her spine that had nothing to do with the cold. Andrea whispered, "Someone already took it." Her eyes darted to the ceiling, small security cameras blinked red. She hurried to the terminal by the freezer door and accessed the footage. The recordings were encrypted, but she managed to load a backup. Grainy, black and white images flickered on screen. She fast-forwarded to the night of Davis George's death. The timestamp read 2:14 a.m. A tall figure entered the lab wearing a surgical mask and gloves. The face was shadowed, but the posture, straight, deliberate, looked familiar. The man walked directly to drawer 12B, removed the vial, and placed it in a metallic case. Before leaving, he turned toward the camera just long enough for the overhead light to catch his profile. Andrea's breath caught. Alex George. Across town, in a penthouse wrapped in glass and grief, Davis Smith was living his own unraveling. Camera flashes burst outside his building like lightning. Reporters swarmed the lobby, shouting questions that cut deeper than any insult. Mr. Smith, is it true your father hid your adoption? Did you falsify corporate records to secure your inheritance? Are you even legally a George? He shut the blinds, but their voices still echoed. Inside, his phone buzzed endlessly, calls from investors, lawyers, and friends who suddenly sounded more cautious than loyal. His board of directors held an emergency meeting without him. The word resignation floated between emails and headlines, growing louder by the hour. He called his mother. The line rang and rang. Then her voicemail. This is Maris George. Leave a message. He didn't. He just stared at the framed photo on his desk, him and his father at a George Motors launch event, both smiling in matching suits. His father's hand rested proudly on his shoulder. Now the world wanted to erase that hand. Erase that legacy. Davis poured himself a drink he couldn't taste and whispered, "What if they're right?" At Street Mary's, Andrea replayed the footage again, watching Alex's silhouette move with surgical precision. This wasn't random. It was rehearsed. He knew exactly where to go, what to take, and how to leave no trace. She printed a still frame, though the image was barely visible. Her instinct screamed at her to bring it to the police, but what would she say? "Hi, I'm a nurse intern with a blurry photo of one of Manhattan's most powerful men stealing a dead patient's blood." No one would believe her. Not yet. She stuffed the printout into her coat pocket and turned off the monitor. That's when the lab phone rang. A chill swept through her. No one ever called the basement line. She hesitated, then picked up. "Hello?" Silence. "Who is this?" A man's voice, low and grainy, crackled through the receiver. "Stop digging, Andrea, or you'll join him in Greenwood." Then click. The line went dead. Andrea stood frozen, the hum of the freezers suddenly sounding like a heartbeat in her ears. She slowly set the phone back on its cradle and backed out of the lab. Her hands were shaking so badly she almost dropped her badge. In that moment, every shred of doubt vanished. This wasn't about a medical error or a misplaced vial. It wasn't even about inheritance. Someone had murdered Davis George. And now, whoever did it knew she was next. Up above the city, the lights of Manhattan glittered like promises that meant nothing. Andrea stepped into the empty street, the echo of that voice still in her head. The storm had started. And this time, she wasn't just caught in it, she was the lightning rod. Andrea had never been to the Upper East Side before sunrise. The streets were too quiet, the brownstones too perfect, as if even the city itself respected the wealth sleeping inside them. But she wasn't here to admire architecture. She stood outside Maris George's penthouse building, her hospital badge clipped to her coat for credibility. The doorman glanced at her with suspicion when she mentioned a follow-up wellness check. But after a phone call upstairs, he waved her through. The elevator ride felt endless. Each floor carried her further from the world she knew, the fluorescent-lit hallways of Street Mary's, the cramped studio apartment in Queens, the life where people like Maris George existed only in news headlines. When the elevator doors opened, Andrea was greeted by silence and marble. The penthouse looked like a museum, curated by grief. Family portraits lined the walls, Davis George smiling at gala events, Davis Smith as a child on his father's shoulders, all smiles and legacy. Maris stood by the window in a silk robe, holding a cup of tea that had gone cold. She looked nothing like the photographs, her poise replaced by something brittle and human. Andrea cleared her throat softly. "Mrs. George? I'm Andrea Smith from Street Mary's Hospital." I just wanted to make sure you were doing okay after sighs. Maris turned, her eyes sharp despite the exhaustion beneath them. After they destroyed my husband's name? After they turned my son into a public spectacle? Her voice cracked, but she caught herself, straightened her spine. Andrea hesitated. I'm sorry for your loss. I know this isn't the right time, but there were irregularities in your husband's records. I think someone tampered with them. Maris's expression faltered. She set her cup down carefully, as though any sudden movement might shatter the world around her. Irregularities? Andrea nodded. Someone accessed his file under my name. They deleted data, altered DNA results, even removed his blood sample from the lab. For a long time, Maris said nothing. The ticking of a grandfather clock filled the room. When she finally spoke, her tone was low, trembling. Then they're doing it again. Andrea blinked. Doing what again? Maris turned toward the window, her reflection merging with the gray Manhattan skyline. Hiding the truth. They sat at the kitchen island, where sunlight filtered weakly through sheer curtains. Maris's manicured hands trembled as she traced the rim of her teacup. 30 years ago, she began. Before I met Davis, I worked as an assistant at a small automotive engineering firm in Queens. There was a man there, Richard Smith. Brilliant, stubborn, gentle in ways that made you trust him. Andrea's breath caught. Richard Smith was my uncle. Maris's gaze lifted slowly. For a moment, the air between them turned to glass. Yes, Maris whispered. I thought the name sounded familiar when I saw your badge that day in the hospital. Andrea felt the ground tilt beneath her. You knew my uncle? Maris nodded. More than knew him. For a few months, we were close. He was engaged at the time, and I was naive enough to believe that love could ignore timing. Her voice softened. When it ended, I buried it. Then I met Davis George, and he offered me a life I never dreamed of. Security, admiration. But when I found out I was pregnant, I knew the child might not be his. Andrea's pulse thudded in her ears. You're saying Davis Smith? Maris's eyes glistened. Is your uncle's blood? Your family's blood? The words hit like a shockwave. Andrea felt her breath catch, her heart stumbling over the realization. All this time she had been fighting for justice for strangers, but they weren't strangers. They were family. She gripped the edge of the counter. Did Mr. George know? Maris nodded, tears spilling now, ruining the perfect image she had worn for decades. He knew. I told him before we married. I thought he'd walk away, but he didn't. He said, if the boy carries your heart, he carries mine. He raised Davis as his own son. Never once did he doubt him. Until now, when he's not here to defend him. Andrea swallowed hard. Then why hide it? Why not tell Davis the truth? Maris turned toward her, eyes hollow. Because truth doesn't always set people free, Miss Smith. Sometimes it burns everything in its path. The two women sat in silence. Outside, the city hummed, oblivious to the secret unfolding inside the penthouse. Maris wiped her tears and straightened. You can't tell anyone what I told you. Not the press, not the police. It would destroy him. My son has already lost his father. Don't take away the only identity he's ever known. Andrea's throat tightened. Mrs. George, this isn't just about family. Someone's manipulating evidence. Someone who might have had a hand in your husband's death. If I stay silent, they win. Maris's voice turned sharp. You don't understand what power looks like in this city. They'll ruin you before they ever face a courtroom. Andrea met her gaze. Maybe. But the truth has to mean something. It has to. For the first time, Maris looked at her not as a nurse, not even as a threat, but as someone she almost admired. You sound like him, she whispered. Like Davis George. That was always his curse, believing truth could outlast greed. Andrea stood to leave. The conversation had left her shaken, hollow, but more certain than ever. She stepped into the hallway, closing the penthouse doors softly behind her. As she descended the marble steps, she noticed a shadow through the frosted glass of the lobby doors. A black SUV idled at the curb, its engine running though no one exited. The tinted window lowered halfway, and for a brief moment, Andrea caught the glint of a camera lens aimed straight at her. Her stomach dropped. She turned away quickly, pulling her coat tight as she stepped into the cold Manhattan morning. Whatever this secret was, it was bigger than DNA, bigger than family. And now, someone out there knew she had uncovered it. By the time Andrea reached Union Square, the winter sun had already dipped behind the skyline, leaving the city wrapped in a restless kind of twilight. The crowds outside Whole Foods Market bustled with the usual rhythm students grabbing last-minute groceries, Wall Street analysts still on Bluetooth calls, delivery drivers racing the clock. To anyone watching, Andrea was just another tired nurse in scrubs. But her pulse told another story. She had sent the email at 3 a.m., her hands shaking as she typed from an encrypted burner account. 2. Smith at private-securemail.com. Subject: The DNA report was falsified. I can prove it. Meet me somewhere ordinary. He had replied with only 4 words. Union Square, 6 p.m., Whole Foods. Andrea adjusted her beanie as she stepped inside the store. The scent of roasted coffee and bakery bread filled the air. She grabbed a shopping basket for camouflage, tossed in a few apples, a carton of oat milk, and walked toward the aisles, her eyes scanning the crowd. Then she saw him, Davis Smith. No security detail, no entourage, just a man in a dark peacoat standing by the self-serve salad bar, pretending to compare quinoa labels. Even exhausted, he carried the quiet gravity of someone raised under scrutiny. He noticed her at the same time. His expression didn't change, but his hand shifted an unspoken signal to keep walking. Andrea obeyed, pushing her cart past him and stopping at the organic produce section. She pulled a folded grocery receipt from her pocket, slipped a tiny USB drive inside, and tucked it between the folds before placing it on the scale. Davis stepped beside her seconds later, picking up a bunch of kale with deliberate slowness. Busy evening, he said casually. Andrea didn't look up. Hospitals never sleep. Neither do corporations under attack, he muttered. She slid the receipt toward him. You'll want to check the vitamins section before you leave. They're good for stress. He nodded once, understanding. And what should I expect to find there? The truth, Andrea said quietly. Or what's left of it? They didn't speak again inside the store. Davis paid for his groceries, left through the revolving doors, and crossed 17th Street toward the Union Square Park benches. Andrea followed a few minutes later, sitting 2 benches away. For several long minutes, they stayed silent. The city roared around them, buses, laughter, sirens. It was the only cover they had. Davis plugged the USB into his laptop. His eyes scanned the files she'd compiled. Screenshots of altered hospital logs, time-stamped access reports, and a folder labeled George, Motors, Labcoms. He clicked one. A string of emails opened between Alex, George, and Gloria, dated 2 days before the funeral. From A. George at georgemotors.com to glel.george at georgemotors.com. Subject: Confirm private test delivery. Make sure results show non-paternity. We'll handle media framing. Keep Davis out of internal review. The nurse account is already flagged. Use her login if possible. Davis's jaw tightened. His voice was low when he spoke. They used you as their scapegoat. Andrea's eyes darkened. They used you to protect their money. For a moment, neither spoke. The wind carried the smell of roasted peanuts from a nearby cart. He turned to her, studying her face, steady, resolute, nothing like the terrified interns who usually flinched around power. Why risk it? You could have deleted everything and walked away. Andrea looked down at her gloves. Because I thought I was helping someone, your father. I saw something in his file, a message he left. He knew this would happen. He wanted someone to protect you. Davis's expression cracked, just for a heartbeat. He always said he didn't trust Alex. I thought it was family rivalry. It wasn't, Andrea said softly. It was survival. They went over the files together, their shoulders nearly touching as the city lights flickered on. Every click revealed another betrayal bank, transfers from George Motors to offshore accounts, a shell company registered under Alex's assistant's name, and a spreadsheet tracking dividends that should have gone to Davis. This isn't just fraud, Davis whispered. It's premeditated. Andrea nodded. Your father's death, the DNA switch, it's all connected. And now we have proof. Davis shut the laptop slowly, the weight of revelation sinking in. If this gets out, George Motors collapses. The board will panic. My mother will be humiliated. Maybe, Andrea said. But truth doesn't care about PR. He glanced at her then, a half-smile ghosting his lips despite the chaos. You sound like someone who still believes truth changes things. I have to, she said, meeting his gaze. Otherwise, what's the point of fighting? For a long second, the noise of the city faded. They were two people from entirely different worlds, Air and Intern, privilege and paycheck, but somehow they stood on the same fragile ground. The moment broke when Andrea's phone buzzed. A text from an unknown number. You shouldn't have met him. Her chest tightened. She turned the screen toward Davis. They're watching. He exhaled, running a hand through his hair. Then we make sure they see what we want them to. Andrea frowned. What do you mean? Davis stood, offering a hand to help her up. Let them think this was a harmless meeting between two people under stress. You go back to work tomorrow. Act like nothing's wrong. Meanwhile, I'll handle Alex. Handle him how? Davis gave a small, grim smile. By showing him that loyalty still has teeth. They parted ways at the subway entrance. Andrea descended into the dim light of the station, her mind spinning with the weight of what they'd uncovered. Above her, through the glass windows of Whole Foods, Davis watched her disappear, the city lights reflecting in his eyes like ghosts of his father's legacy. Somewhere, miles away, Alex George was likely toasting his own victory, unaware that the truth he'd buried was already breathing again. As Andrea's train roared into the tunnel, she whispered to herself, You said protect him, Mr. George. I'm trying. Sometimes, the right people find each other when the world is against them. If you've ever had to stand your ground when no one believed you, you'll understand why this moment matters. The morning after the meeting at Whole Foods, Andrea woke to the sound of rain against her window and the faint hum of New York traffic below. Her apartment, usually her only refuge, felt colder, emptier. She hadn't slept much. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw the words, You shouldn't have met him, flashing on her phone screen. But fear had become a luxury she couldn't afford. She made coffee that tasted like courage, threw on her scrubs, and headed to St. Mary's Hospital. The halls felt different now, too quiet, like everyone knew something she didn't. A few nurses avoided her eyes. One even whispered, That's her, as she passed. Andrea logged into the medical record system again. this time bypassing the general interface through a diagnostic access panel she'd learned about from a friendly IT tech. The deeper she went, the more inconsistencies appeared. There it was, a document flagged confidential legal hold. She opened it. Toxicology report? Davis George. Her stomach twisted. The official file on record listed the billionaire's death as complications from heart failure. But the buried report told a different story: high concentrations of digoxin, a cardiac medication used in small doses for arrhythmia. In excessive amounts, it stopped the heart. Someone had switched his medication. Andrea scrolled further, her breath catching as she saw the signature. Dr. Alan Pierce, the same attending physician who had signed off on all of Davis George's care. Attached to the file was a consulting invoice for $85,000 from Pierce Medical Advisors, LLC, a shell company recently added to the hospital's vendor list. Her heart pounded. The payee address matched an entity under Alex George's consulting firm. Andrea leaned back in her chair, the screen's glow making her skin look ghostly. You paid the doctor, she whispered. You killed your own brother. Across town, in the glittering high-rise of George Motors' headquarters, the boardroom buzzed with tension. Reporters had camped outside for days, demanding a statement about the ongoing scandal. Inside, Alex George stood at the head of the polished mahogany table, calm and composed, every inch the corporate savior. Our goal, he told the board, is to restore public confidence. My nephew is overwhelmed, and until these personal issues are resolved, I'll continue as acting CEO. A murmur of agreement passed through the room except from one end of the table. Davis Smith leaned forward, his tone controlled but sharp. You mean until you finish rewriting history? Alex smiled coolly. Careful, Davis. You're still under media scrutiny. Any outburst could damage what's left of our family's reputation. Davis met his gaze evenly. Reputation? You mean your lies? You forged my DNA report, paid off doctors, and now you're hiding behind PR statements. Gasps rippled across the table. Gloria George, sitting beside Alex, tightened her grip on her pen. Alex chuckled softly. You've been listening to rumors. I suggest you focus on your personal matters. Leave business to the adults. Davis pushed back from his chair. Then let's bring in the adults. I'm calling for a full re-audit of the company's medical partnerships, Street Marys included. A silence so deep followed that even the air conditioning seemed to stop. You wouldn't dare, Alex said quietly. I just did, Davis replied. That afternoon, Andrea returned home to find her apartment door slightly open. Her pulse jumped. She hesitated in the hallway, listening. Nothing. She pushed the door with her foot. It creaked open to reveal chaos. Her drawers were overturned, her laptop gone, and her printed documents, everything about the George file, were missing. She stepped inside, heart racing, scanning the wreckage. Her bedroom closet had been emptied, her desk smashed. But the worst discovery came when she checked her cloud backup. All files wiped. Andrea sank onto the floor, trembling. Whoever had done this had access, power, and precision, and they wanted her silence. But they'd underestimated her. From under her couch, she pulled out a small, fireproof box. Inside, wrapped in brown paper, was a second USB drive, the one she'd copied before leaving the hospital that morning. The data was safe. For now, she exhaled shakily. You can break my door, but not the truth. That night, she met Davis again, this time in the dim glow of a parking garage beneath George Motors. He looked different now, less composed, more human. His tie hung loose, and his eyes carried exhaustion that no luxury could mask. They broke into your place? He asked quietly. Andrea nodded. They took everything, but I saved one copy. Your uncle's death wasn't natural, Davis. He was poisoned. He froze. Poisoned? She handed him the printed toxicology summary. Digoxin overdose. Your uncle's doctor received payment from one of Alex's shell companies days before the incident. Davis stared at the paper, disbelief turning into fury. That bastard! Andrea reached out instinctively, placing a hand on his arm. We can prove it. But we have to be careful. He's watching both of us. For a moment, the air between them felt charged, not just with danger, but with something unspoken. Connection. Trust. Davis looked at her, voice low. You're risking everything for this. For me. Andrea shook her head. Not for you. For justice. For the man your father really was. He smiled faintly, the kind of smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. Then, I guess we're both our father's children after all. Outside, thunder rolled over the skyline, echoing through the canyons of Manhattan. Andrea stood by the open window of the parking deck, rain slicking her hair as Davis made a call to his legal team, demanding the re-audit in writing. She watched him, realizing how far they'd both come from an overworked nurse and a broken heir to two people standing on the front line of a war against power itself. The storm broke, drenching the city in sheets of cold rain. Somewhere out there, Alex George would already be moving to destroy them. But Andrea no longer felt afraid. Truth was coming, and she was done running from it. The next morning broke cold and silver, the kind of January day that made the city look like a memory. Andrea stood at the gates of Greenwood Cemetery, clutching a small bouquet of white roses and a folded document authorizing her retrieval of memorial artifacts. It was half truth, half forgery one Davis Smith had quietly arranged through a sympathetic contact at City Hall. The cemetery was still except for the rustle of bare trees. Snow dusted the gravestones, and the skyline beyond Brooklyn shimmered in the distance. When she reached Davis George's mausoleum, Andrea hesitated. Inside, the marble chamber smelled faintly of lilies and polished stone. The billionaire's portrait stared out from the memorial display, stoic, dignified, forever untouchable. Beneath the frame, a small glass dome held a lock of his hair, sealed as part of the funeral's memorial keepsake. Her reflection flickered on the glass as she whispered, "You left me a trail, didn't you?" Then, steadying her hands, she lifted the dome and carefully cut a single strand. Later that afternoon, Andrea met Davis in the backseat of a parked black sedan on a quiet Queens side street. The storm from the night before had left puddles shining like oil under the pale winter sun. He looked tired but calmer, his voice quieter now that the shock of betrayal had hardened into focus. "Are you sure about this?" Andrea nodded. "It's the only way to end the lies. I need a fresh sample from you." He hesitated just long enough to remind her that he was still a man raised behind locked gates and guarded reputations. But then he pulled a hair from his head, placed it in a small plastic vial, and said softly, "Do what you have to." She tucked the vials in her coat pocket. "I'll take them to someone I trust." "Not the hospital?" he asked. Andrea shook her head. "No. Street Mary's is compromised. If Alex's people find out, they'll intercept the results before I even get the email." That night, she drove across the East River into Queens, to a small, independent forensic lab run by Dr. Lena Torres, a friend from nursing school. The building sat wedged between a laundromat and a storage facility, humble, unassuming, exactly what Andrea needed. Inside, Lena greeted her with a hug that felt like home. "Girl, you look like you haven't slept since Christmas." "Not since someone tried to erase me," Andrea said wryly. Lena raised an eyebrow. "So this is about that billionaire mess everyone's talking about?" Andrea hesitated, then handed her the vials. "I need you to test these. quietly. One's from Davis Smith, the other from his father's memorial. I need to know if they're related. Lena studied her face. You know this could get me blacklisted, right? I wouldn't ask if it weren't life or death. Lena sighed, nodded, and got to work. Give me an hour. Andrea waited in the dimly lit lab office, her nerves raw. The hum of equipment and the rhythmic clicking of the sequencer filled the silence. Outside, snow began to fall again, soft, soundless, merciful. When Lena finally returned, her expression was unreadable. She held a printout in one hand, a coffee mug in the other. Andrea stood. Well? Lena placed the report on the desk and exhaled. The markers match. 99.9% probability. Davis Smith is Davis George's biological son. Andrea blinked, the words taking a heartbeat to land. So, the first test was completely fabricated, Lena interrupted. Whoever altered it wasn't even subtle. They spliced synthetic data to make it look like a mismatch. Amateur work, if you know what to look for. Andrea sank into the nearest chair, a wave of relief washing through her, but it wasn't the calm kind. It was the kind that came with a new kind of terror. She rubbed her temples. Then why go through all this trouble? Why destroy his name if he was the rightful heir all along? Lena frowned. Because it's never just about family with people like that. It's about money. Andrea froze. Money, control, inheritance. Suddenly, everything connected: the falsified report, the bribed doctor, the confidential hospital records. She opened her laptop, pulling up the last folder Davis had given her, George Motors' internal audits. Among the spreadsheets was a file labeled Q4 Exports, offshore. She clicked it open and gasped. Millions in unaccounted funds had been rerouted through shell companies linked to subsidiaries in Singapore and the Cayman Islands, all under Gloria George's signature. Andrea's voice trembled. They weren't just cutting Davis out of the will. They were covering up embezzlement. Lena leaned in. So they faked the DNA to disinherit him, make him look illegitimate. That way, no one would question where the money went. Andrea nodded slowly, every puzzle piece locking into place. And when his father started to suspect, they silenced him. Lena finished grimly. Andrea closed her laptop, the truth feeling heavier than the lie ever had. The proof was there now, hard data, irrefutable. But it wasn't victory she felt. It was dread, because proof made her dangerous. She thanked Lena, promised to stay safe, and slipped back into the night. The snow had stopped, but the air carried that stillness that only comes before a storm breaks again. Driving back toward Manhattan, Andrea caught a glimpse of her reflection in the windshield, tired, wary, but unbroken. The truth she carried could clear a man's name, destroy two powerful people, and finally expose the rot at the heart of George Motors. But it could also cost her everything. She whispered to herself, voice barely audible over the hum of the car engine. The second test wasn't just proof it's a weapon, and she knew exactly who it would strike next. The courthouse at 60 Center Street had seen its share of power and scandal, but that morning it pulsed with a rare electricity. Outside, the steps overflowed with reporters shouting questions into the winter air. Inside, the marble halls echoed with heels, whispers, and tension. Manhattan Surrogate's Court, Room 208, the hearing of George Estate versus Smith. Andrea stood by the witness bench, her palms damp, her heart steady but fast. She had spent 3 nights rehearsing her testimony with Davis's attorney, but nothing could prepare her for the eyes watching now: judges, journalists, the board of George Motors, and every vulture of New York's elite waiting to see who would fall. At the front of the courtroom sat Judge Evelyn Monroe, sharp-eyed and stone-faced, a woman known for smelling lies the way bloodhounds smelled fear. Across from Andrea sat Alex George, crisp as ever in his tailored navy suit. His sister, Gloria, sat beside him, pretending calm, but tapping one manicured finger on the table. Their attorneys whispered frantically, arranging folders that, in a few minutes, would mean nothing. And on the opposite side, Davis Smith. He didn't look like an heir today. He looked like a man stripped bare of everything but truth. When the bailiff called Andrea's name, the air seemed to thin. She stood, raised her hand, and swore under oath. "Miss Smith," began Davis's attorney, Howard Greer, a composed man with silver hair and the patient authority of someone who had been doing this for 30 years. "Please tell the court what you discovered regarding the DNA evidence in the late Mr. Davis George's case." Andrea adjusted the microphone, her voice firm. The initial DNA test, which claimed Davis Smith was not biologically related to his father, was falsified. The file in the hospital system was altered after Mr. George's death. When I accessed the original sequence, the genetic markers matched perfectly, 99.9% probability of paternity. Murmurs rippled through the gallery. "Who verified your findings?" Greer asked. "The Federal Bureau of Investigation," Andrea replied. "Their forensic genetics division confirmed the results. The second test I submitted came directly from preserved hair samples of both father and son. The data cannot be disputed." Alex shifted in his chair, his jaw tightening. Greer handed a folder to the clerk. "For the record, Exhibit D, the FBI's certified analysis confirming Davis Smith as the biological son of Davis George." Judge Monroe examined the papers, her expression unreadable. Greer stepped closer to the witness stand. "Miss Smith, in your professional capacity, did you find any evidence explaining why the initial DNA results were manipulated?" "Yes," Andrea said. "The falsified data was uploaded through an external lab contracted under a private consulting firm registered to Alex George. Payments from George Motors' corporate accounts were wired to that lab the day before the report was released." Gasps broke out. Reporters scribbled like wildfire. "And were those payments authorized by hospital administration?" "No," Andrea said. "They were disguised as equipment maintenance fees. When I followed the audit trail, I found 2 transfer signatures, Alex George and Gloria George." The judge raised an eyebrow. "You're certain?" Andrea met her eyes. "Yes, Your Honor. I saw their signatures on the access request, and I have digital verification logs proving it." The courtroom erupted in noise, voices rising, cameras flashing. Alex slammed a hand on the table. "This is absurd. She's a nurse, a glorified intern with a vendetta." Judge Monroe banged her gavel once. "Mr. George, you will control yourself." But Alex wasn't done. "You think this woman can dismantle my company with screenshots and sob stories? My brother was reckless, sentimental, and she's exploiting that for fame." "Enough," the judge thundered. "One more outburst, and you'll be held in contempt." Andrea sat frozen, but inside, a quiet calm settled. He was unraveling. Greer turned to the clerk. "Your Honor, may I introduce one final piece of evidence?" The judge nodded. The lights dimmed as a projector flickered to life. On screen appeared grainy security footage from St. Mary's Hospital. The timestamp? 2:14 a.m., 2 days before Davis George's death. The courtroom went still. The video showed Alex George entering the restricted cold storage lab wearing gloves, removing a vial from drawer 12B, placing it in a silver case, then glancing up at the camera before leaving. The silence that followed was almost sacred. Alex's lawyer jumped up. "Your Honor, this footage is inadmissible." "It's been authenticated by the FBI's Digital Forensics Unit," Greer countered. Chain of custody is verified. Judge Monroe leaned forward, studying the screen. Then she turned to Alex. Mr. George, do you wish to explain what business you had accessing a deceased patient's biological material after midnight? Alex opened his mouth, but nothing came out. Gloria whispered, Alex, stop. But he shoved her hand away. You don't understand, he hissed. That company was mine before Davis took it. The gavel struck twice, echoing through the chamber. Order! Judge Monroe shouted. An hour later, after a recess filled with chaos, the courtroom reconvened. The judge read her verdict in a voice like iron. The court finds overwhelming evidence of fraud, forgery, and deliberate obstruction of justice. The late Davis George's estate shall transfer to his rightful heir, Davis Smith. All pending claims by Alex and Gloria George are hereby dismissed. Further, the court recommends criminal investigation into financial misconduct. Andrea closed her eyes, a breath of relief breaking through weeks of fear. Across the aisle, Davis's hands clenched into fists, not in anger, but in gratitude. The reporters burst from the gallery as Alex shouted something incoherent before being restrained by deputies. Gloria buried her face in her hands. Andrea rose from the witness stand, feeling the weight of it all lift like light cracking through after a long storm. When she met Davis's eyes across the room, there were no words, only a shared understanding. The truth had survived, and so had they. Outside, the cameras waited. But for now, in that crowded courtroom, justice finally had a voice, and it spoke through a nurse who refused to be silent. The moment the gavel struck, the courtroom transformed into chaos. Reporters surged forward, cameras flashing like lightning. Through the noise, the bailiff's voice cut through. Alex and Gloria George, you are under arrest for fraud, obstruction, and evidence tampering. Andrea watched as the siblings were led away, Alex's defiance melting into disbelief. Gloria cried quietly, whispering something no one could hear. For a brief second, Andrea saw the remnants of a family that had built an empire and destroyed itself in the process. Outside the courthouse, the steps of 60 Center Street were a storm of microphones and questions. The winter air carried the electric scent of victory and vindication. When Davis Smith emerged, the crowd fell silent. The man who had been labeled fake heir for weeks now stood tall beneath the camera lights, his voice calm and deliberate. My father taught me that family isn't proven by DNA, it's proven by loyalty, he said, his breath visible in the cold. He built George Motors not just with innovation, but with integrity. And thanks to one nurse who refused to stay silent, that truth survived. The crowd erupted in applause. Cameras clicked. Andrea stood at the edge of the steps, half hidden behind the press barricade, watching him speak. He didn't look like a billionaire reclaiming a fortune. He looked like a son honoring his father's ghost. When he caught her gaze across the crowd, he didn't wave or smile. He just nodded, a quiet acknowledgement between two people who had walked through the fire and come out scarred, but unbroken. That evening, as Manhattan's skyline shimmered against a bruised winter sky, Andrea found herself once again at Greenwood Cemetery. The world had returned to motion, the media frenzy, the stock markets, the chatter about George Motors reborn. She knelt beside Davis George's grave, brushing away the light dusting of snow that had gathered on the headstone. From her coat pocket, she pulled out a single white rose and placed it gently on the stone. You protected your son, she whispered. I just finished what you started. Her voice trembled slightly. It wasn't sorrow, it was release. A soft crunch of footsteps echoed behind her. She turned, and there he was, Davis, dressed simply in a dark coat, his expression a mix of exhaustion and peace. "I thought I might find you here," he said quietly. "I figured this was where the story began," Andrea replied. "It's only right it ends here, too." He stepped closer, standing beside her. "It doesn't end," he said. "Not really." For a while, they said nothing. The city's glow was faint in the distance, the hum of life reaching even this place of rest. Davis looked down at the grave. "You know, I spent years trying to live up to his name, trying to prove I was worthy of being a George. Turns out, I was one all along." Andrea smiled faintly. He knew. He just needed someone brave enough to prove it. He looked at her, then really looked. "You've been through hell for a family that wasn't even yours." "Maybe that's the point," she said softly. "Truth doesn't belong to anyone. You just fight for it until it stands on its own." Davis's hand brushed hers. It wasn't a grand gesture, just enough to say thank you, stay, breathe. For the first time in months, Andrea let herself exhale. Later, as they walked out through the cemetery gates, the air seemed lighter. The world outside still buzzed with the noise of headlines and justice and corporate fallout, but none of it mattered in that quiet stretch of Brooklyn night. Davis glanced sideways at her. "You know, my board wants to make a public statement next week. Rebuilding, reforming the company, all that. They want me to announce new leadership positions." Andrea raised an eyebrow. "And you're telling me because?" "Because one of them involves medical ethics oversight. Someone who understands how systems fail people and how to stop that from happening again." Andrea stopped walking. "You're offering me a job?" He smiled. "I'm offering you a purpose, the one you already live by." She laughed softly, shaking her head. "You really think they'll let a nurse from Queens sit in the same meetings as Manhattan's elite?" "They'll have to," he said. "You're the reason they still have a company." They reached the curb where his car waited. For a moment, the wind lifted her hair, carrying the faint scent of roses. She looked back at the cemetery gates, then at the skyline beyond the Empire State Building glowing faintly through the clouds. "Funny," she said. "The truth nearly killed us, but somehow it feels like the only thing worth living for." Davis nodded, his voice low. "Because it's eternal. Like he said, integrity doesn't die when people do." She smiled. "Guess that's one legacy we both get to keep." As they drove back toward the city, the streets glittered with reflected light yellow taxis, wet asphalt, neon signs. The skyline loomed ahead, vast and alive. Inside the car, silence stretched between them. But it was a good kind of silence, the kind that comes after battles are won and grief begins to heal. When Andrea glanced out the window, she saw their reflections side by side, the billionaire's son and the nurse who saved him. Two strangers who'd met by accident, bound now by truth, loyalty, and something deeper neither dared to name. The camera of the world might have moved on. But in that moment, beneath the glow of the Manhattan lights, it felt like the story was still being written. Because some truths don't fade. Some hearts never lie. And sometimes, redemption doesn't roar, it simply exhales. If this story reminded you that integrity still matters, that one person's courage can rewrite history, don't just scroll past. Hit that subscribe button, drop a like, and tell us in the comments where in the world you're watching from and which part of the story hit you the hardest. We've got more powerful, emotional stories coming your way. And trust me, you don't want to miss them.